Okay. Oh, you are. It says you're live.
Yes, it's come up on my screen. So on that assumption, we'll start the meeting. So good afternoon to the Children and Young People's Committee. I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching the live stream via the County Council's website. Members, you are aware by now, you need to keep your video switched on and for the duration of the meeting, and also to mute your microphone unless you're invited to speak. Please click on the raised hand function if you wish to ask a question, and I'll invite you to come into the meeting. There's always a risk we may run into technical problems. I would ask for your patience should this occur. I will declare an adjournment while the fault is addressed, and the public broadcast will be paused. If it's not possible to address the problem, the meeting may need to be abandoned and reconvened at a later date, but we'll cross that bridge as necessary. Please also note that to facilitate discussion, I intend to waiver the committee procedure rules limiting members' contributions to 5 minutes. I also propose to allow members to speak more than once on each item, if appropriate. However, please make your contributions concise and to the point. And please also note that we've got quite a large agenda today. So finally, I'd also like to remind members, officers and public speakers, well, there isn't any, but that virtual meetings are broadcast live and the video recording will be published on the Council's website. Okay, so we'll move to agenda item number 1. Members, I will begin by calling the names of all members of the committee to establish your presence. Before I do this, Michelle, we haven't received any notifications of apologies, have we?
I have no apologies.
Okay, so here we go then. So Councillor Ambrose Smith.
Present.
Councillor Downs.
Present.
Councillor Every.
Present.
Councillor Hay.
Present.
Councillor Hoy.
Present.
Councillor Netzinger.
Present.
Councillor Simon Taylor.
Present.
Councillor Whitehead.
Present.
Councillor Wisson.
Present.
And our 2 co-opted members, Andrew Reid representing the Church of England Diocese of Ely.
Present.
And Flavio Vitesse representing the Roman Catholic Diocese of East Anglia.
Present.
And of course myself, Councillor Bywater, as chair. Okay, so does any member have any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest that they wish to make known? Okay, if something does come up, just raise your hand and we'll take that as noted during the course of the meeting. We are now being asked to approve the minutes of the meeting on the 1st of December as a correct record. Can I ask if any member who does not agree with this proposal to click on the raised hand function on the right of your screen now? Okay, I see no objections to the proposal to approve the minutes as a correct record, so I will take that as carried and I will eventually sign a copy once I get back into Shire Hall. Action log. An updated action log was included in the published papers of the meeting. If any members have a question on the action log, would they use the raised hand function on the right hand side of the screen to show this? Okay, so no members have indicated that they wish to speak, so we will take the action log as noted. Item 3, which is petitions of the public. We have received no petitions or public questions on this item, so we will move on. We're now moving on to agenda item 4, which is the school building standard specifications. Ian Trafford, the Education Capital Strategy Manager, will introduce the report, and Alison Revel, Education Capital Projects Manager, is also available to answer questions. Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. I think when we were given the task of preparing this report on building standards and specifications, we've interpreted that brief quite widely, so it is quite a detailed and lengthy report. It covers new builds and extensions, and in particular the building costs, the amount of accommodation to be provided, and the materials and the performance of the buildings that we deliver, referred to as in the report as an output specification. The report also looks at the condition and suitability of the existing building stock, particularly the maintained schools. And because the adoption of the County Council's policies on the climate emergency are quite recent, we've also covered in the report how our approach is developing to that set of policies as well. I think in terms of why it's always useful to keep how we build schools and our standards under review, I think it's probably important because the standards and costs of our buildings do feed directly into the council's 5-year schools capital programme, which is a sizable programme. And these costs and standards, they also form the basis for our negotiation with developers and district councils of our contributions, 106 and SIL contributions, to support the cost of building these schools or expanding existing ones, particularly linked to new development and housing growth. I think it's probably timely as well, because for a number of reasons, and we set those out in the report, the council at the moment is in the position where we're using 2 different standards for school buildings, depending on the sources of funding and the requirements of the new developments where a lot of the new schools and extended schools are located. These standards are covered in something called building bulletins issued by the DfE. We have the BB 98 and 99 that did govern primary and secondary, and more recently, since 2014, Building Bulletin, or BB 103. I mean, I think it's probably recognised that it would be beneficial to operate to a single agreed standard across the county as a baseline, and in the report we've suggested how we might get to that point. And in terms of the existing stock, we have been called out to a number of emergencies over the last 12 months, and particularly over the summer period, relating to exceptional rainfall events. But that has led to some concerns being expressed about the overall condition of the maintained schools estate, which we're responsible for. So if I just cover some of the key issues on new build and extensions, I think in terms of the cost, it's probably a question of which target we adopt. There are a number of industry measures, but we want to choose, or we tried to choose the one that's most effective in measuring build costs, but also enable a proper comparison to be made with other local authorities. So we've opted to go for the National School Benchmarking Data Report costs, as it allows a direct comparison of the cost of individual elements of a building. But it's the cost measure that enjoys the greatest support of the Cabinet Office and DfE, and local authorities have been working with them on that. We've chosen a range around the average of these national costs expressed as a square metre to use going forward. And I think by using a point within the wider range, going forward, we can monitor our project costs and provide a bit more visibility when identifying reasons for falling outside that target or range we've set ourselves. I think importantly, the other cost measure in place is the DfE cost per place measure, which is widely used and was used in the DfE audit of local authorities. But we're not recommending that measure, although it serves a purpose for allocating basic need capital funding. Cost per place, pupil place, can vary widely, as the accommodation required in any given school to expand it by a given number of places can vary enormously, so that cost figure can move around quite considerably. In terms of the area of the buildings and the accommodation provided in different DfE building bulletins, it was often sort of presented as a binary choice between the two. Do we go for BB 99 and 98, or BB 103, one standard being higher than the other? However, as we've looked into it a bit more closely, there is flexibility that exists within the most recent Building Bulletin 103 guidance. And if this is used, the higher end of that bulletin actually does overlap with the lower end of the earlier bulletins it replaced. So we're recommending that we use the BB 103 guidance across all schemes, but use the flexibility within it. So we actually adopt a single measure But the use of this flexibility will also have added benefits, and we'll be able to respond to the organisational and learning needs of schools, but also meet, we think, the planning requirements, which can be quite onerous, of building a new school within a major new housing site. So we think we can move to that one standard and make it work in both circumstances. And again, in terms of visibility, I think in our stage reporting on schemes, we can always as well report on how we've used that flexibility available within BB 103, so it's a little more visible. We're not suggesting any changes to the output specification. We do vary a little bit as an authority from what's set out in BB 103, but we've adopted some of those differences based upon practice and our experience on building projects. So as I say, we'll keep those as they are, but keep them under review. If I move on to the existing stock of buildings, probably the main area of our involvement is on building condition. At the moment, the council invests its allocated condition funding for maintained schools that we receive from the DfE each year in the highest priority condition issues, and tackling those in accordance with the DfE grading approach. A challenge has been set us by the Officer Capital Programme Board in response to the need for extra funds they've had to deal with when we've gone to it in association with some of those building emergencies I referred to. And we need to ascertain whether our current approach, as the question being asked, is sufficient to either maintain the overall condition of the school's estate, either in a steady state, or is it either improving or declining? So while we've got a programme of works, we couldn't really answer that question. So we're going to do that analysis based on new condition data that's just in. And if there is a need to move to a needs-based budget that's above what we're currently investing, that would come back to this committee via the Capital Programme Board and come forward in the next business planning cycle. Within the existing stock, we also covered fire management, but the recommendation here is that we await what happens nationally before we revisit it at a future date. At the moment, the fire safety bill is passing through Parliament, and the DfE are consulting on a significant revision to Building Bulletin 100, which covers the whole area of fire management, and has just completed a consultation with local authorities. So changes are in the offing, and when we get the details of any recommendations coming from government or DfE, we will come back with our approach on the issue of fire management, which does include sprinklers and suppression systems, along with other issues. In terms of sustainability, it's probably early days, but the report does set out how we started to respond to the Council's policies on climate change, and in particular the new focus on reduction of carbon in construction and building operation. For new builds, we're developing a standard linked to NZEB and an actual live project rather than doing something more theoretical, and we're using the development of the Alconbury Weald to do this, and this design and new standard will be developed over the period of the next 6 months. That project is now into the detailed design phase. For existing schools where boiler replacements are required, we're working with the energy team and we're seeking to replace them with non-carbon heating solutions where we can. I suppose at the moment, our extra investment at the moment needs to be supported by a business case and how you share some of the costs of that, so with sponsors of schools, so that the county council gets repaid some of its extra investment, and or accessing government green energy grants or loans, which obviously makes the installation of these systems, the business case, stack up. I think just a word of warning on that, the green energy loans and grants that we're currently accessing from government are becoming increasingly competitive and oversubscribed. So it may get harder over time to access these. And we've just had a couple of projects put on hold because of that. I think those are the main areas of the report. I think the way it's broken down, we've got recommendations on each of those main areas. So I'll stop there and hand back to the chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Just before I go to members, Alison, is there anything you'd like to add to the committee to highlight if there's anything you want to put forward?
No, not really. We are operating on a two-tier system at the moment. What Ian didn't say that's included in the paper is that there is a historical amount of money that was agreed in section 106 that's still in our capital programme. So projects that were basically negotiated with developers at a higher rate than what our current pounds per square metre is. And with that, there's an expectation of very good solutions or brilliant solutions, landmark building type solutions. So then that puts the disparity between the projects, it makes them even more focused. So what we're proposing is to bring that standard down, but bring the lower standard up to just sort of not make the differences so noticeable.
Okay, thanks, Alison.
Thank you, Alison.
We'll move to members. So we've got Councillor Whitehead first, and then Councillor Netzinger.
Thank you, Chair. It's just really to test my understanding, I think, which is mainly centred around paragraph 2.3.4 on page 15. Am I correct in my understanding that the new government guidelines are suggesting that schools should be smaller in an area, which does seem to me to certainly reduce a certain amount of flexibility, and certainly that paragraph concentrates on the fact of the need for flexibility. So are you saying, Ian, that by adopting the top end of the range of BB 103, then we will still be able to build schools of a comparable size to what we're building now, which will allow us to have the kind of flexibility that that paragraph indicates that we need? Is my understanding correct in that regard?
Yes, it is. I suppose it's not so much a new standard either, BB 103. It's been around since 2014. But you're quite right. I suppose in the debate between the two standards, the focus has often been on the minimum of BB 103, which is about, as we said, 15% less in overall area than the previous standard. But there is, as I said, quite a range within that for any particular type of space or group of spaces. And the upper end of that range does cross over with the bottom end of the previous range. So, as Alison says, it's not necessarily the case that we'll be building smaller. We'll just be using the flexibility that does exist within that range, and that's a bit of a balancing act so that we can get over this perceived two-tier approach, or even maybe actual two-tier approach if we carried on in with the current arrangement. So there might be some of the schools in new developments may be a bit tighter on space, but we won't be building to the minimum area where we're, say, expanding existing school and using our own basic need funding to do it. So those will be slightly more generous than minimum area, which I think was where we were sat because of earlier decisions. We'd taken a decision that because we were under pressure financially to reduce borrowing at the time, anything involving borrowing or our basic need allocation would be built at minimum area. But where we'd negotiated the 106s, we'd stay at BB 103 minimum area, but where we'd negotiated the 106s, they would have still been at the higher the higher BB 98, 99 standard, and that meant there was a big gap there. So some may come down in new developments as a result, but not by much. And there'll be more equity with sort of existing schools that are expanded, or schemes that are using council funding resources will be above the minimum. So as Alison described, it's sort of coming together.
So you don't feel that the BB 103 is going to pose constraints that are going to make it difficult for us sometimes to meet flexibility? You don't think that's the case?
I don't think that's the case if we use it as it's intended to be used, and we listen to sort of what schools are saying about their curriculum needs and organisational requirements. I think there's enough flexibility within that to satisfy both the sort of planning requirements of new developments, but also the organisational curriculum needs when we're sort of looking at existing schools and expanding those as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Nexinger, followed by Councillor Hay.
Thank you. My points follow on almost exactly from Joan's, in that I was also extremely concerned that this change would mean that we would be reducing the size of the classrooms that we're building in new schools in Cambridgeshire. If that is not the case, then that's very reassuring. But I am still concerned that that particularly in new areas, that we will be building schools with smaller classrooms than was the case in the past. I understand your point about that we can use the upper end of that BB 103 range, but my concern is that if we're in discussions with developers, those Section 106 debates are always tough and energetic, and that if you do say that there is an option that we are following the BB 103 set of guidelines, they will start from the position of using the bottom end of those guidelines, which is not what we should be doing for new schools in Cambridgeshire. The new schools that we're building in Cambridgeshire at the moment will be very long-term assets for this county, and having large classrooms does make a significant difference to the quality of education that happens to for those children in those classrooms. We already have some of the smallest and most overcrowded classrooms in Europe, and we've seen some of the consequences of that in the spread of COVID in small and overcrowded classrooms already. So I am very concerned that there will be smaller classrooms being built, potentially very significantly smaller in new areas across the county. So if you can tell me that's not the case, then I will be a bit reassured. But at the moment, I don't feel that I can support anything that would make that more likely. I've got another point. I don't know whether you want to come back on that one before I make this.
I'll do my best, Lucy, to answer that one first. I think, and Alison may want to add to this as she's got more experience of the delivering schools in new developments. First of all, I think it's important to mention that not all of the difference between what we considered were the two standards that we're doing at the moment were entirely down to area. There are some in terms of the design approach, the landmark building approach, having to comply with urban design codes and that type of thing, and certain materials that we had to use that added to cost. There's also, in terms of making that landmark status, some of that extra cost didn't go into necessarily floor space. When we talk about space, it went into volume and building height, which also has a cost. So I think in terms of, I mean, based on the wishes of members, in terms of how we approach new schools in new developments, you're right, it's very much a negotiation. And, you know, I would never start a negotiation from the bottom. So, I mean, I think what you would do is you'd say, you know, in keeping with the previous approach, we're using the top end of BB 103 because we very much want to, you know, remain consistent with what we've delivered before in terms of the area and the standard of the schools. So I suppose to answer the question, you know, it's how we approach the negotiation. And if the expectation is we approach it that we build to somewhere near the top end of BB 103, that's where we'll start from. And like any other subject or any other requirement that we have to justify with developers, we would seek to justify it and hold that line.
I have to say I'm not reassured by what you've just said, because actually what you've done is make it very clear that this is a negotiation, and that I mean, if you start with a guide range and you say we're starting at the top of this range, then you negotiate and the thing slips further down. Whereas if you're talking about the BB 99 or 98, there isn't a bottom of that range, which is much smaller than we've been having at the moment. I mean there is nowhere for it to slip, and therefore the ability for that negotiation to go badly is less. So I do feel that actually, given that this is a negotiation, actually moving to those other guidelines is going to be a problem for us, because it means it's more difficult to hold the line against those developers. I mean, the points that you make about the cost of school buildings being added to by the need to comply with urban design codes and building and height volume, those are also things that matter when you're designing new schools. They may not be classroom area considerations, but they do also have an impact on whether those are high quality buildings that will be valued by their communities for many decades to come, which is absolutely what we ought to be building for our new communities in Cambridgeshire. And we need to be making sure that we are maintaining those standards. And if this change to the building standards is going to make it easier for developers to argue against us in that negotiation, I don't think it's something we should be doing. Right, to move on to my second point, which was when you were talking about building emergencies and our approach to the maintenance of our current schools estate. I agree that it's extremely helpful to have a review of the way in which our estate is being managed, and on whether or not we are doing sufficient in terms of our school maintenance to maintain the schools in their current condition, or to improve it, or for it to be falling behind. And I have to say that as a school governor, my entire instinct is that the quality of our school buildings is gradually deteriorating over time, because there is not that maintenance budget there to maintain them, and that is why we are getting increasing numbers of urgent building emergencies coming forward. If that is what this investigation shows, will there be more support from central government for that increased maintenance requirement? And if not, where does the money come from?
Okay, there may not be increased government support arising from that piece of work. What I am aware of from early discussions with the DFE is that there could be increased condition allocations down the line, or the condition pot nationally is being increased. And the DFE, well, they're trailing that, so we could have increased condition allocations from next year, but that's more to do with national policy around, well, maybe a perception that condition is declining, but around building back better and supporting the economy. So how that would translate into an individual allocation to Cambridgeshire, I don't know, but linked to our own study, I think it's very much something that if we decided, I don't know, at the moment the condition of the estate is declining, but we want to reach a level of investment that means it's in a steady state or even improving. The means for doing that would be a bid to the Capital Programme Board, and then coming back through the business planning process next year. So while we might get more condition funding from central government in the future, I think any consideration linked to our own desire to either improve the school's estate would be something that we would have to make a business case for, and it would come through the business planning process next year once we've looked at the evidence and the latest condition data we've had from reports completed in the autumn of 2020.
Ian, John, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, just want to comment really and add to that, add to what Ian said. You know, two things at play here. One, we do receive a maintenance allocation. We have often subsidised our basic need pot using that resource. So we've not always been able to spend what we've been given to support you know, the maintenance of our buildings. I think we also need to set in the context that our schools are some of the lowest funded in the country. So their revenue budgets that support the maintenance of things like gutters and electrical systems and, you know, replacement things is limited as well. You know, for me, you know, if I've got to make a decision around how big a classroom is in a new school or keeping the existing stock up to date, I think that's where we need to invest our money. I think that there is a emerging issue around the condition of our buildings, and we are going to have to fundamentally look at where we invest, whether we can access additional resources, because otherwise we're building a bigger legacy that will come from you know, the need to rebuild than there is in, you know, slightly smaller new builds. So I'm afraid that, you know, we've got to make some really tough decisions here. We may need to borrow more, but we may need to make some tough decisions about new build as well. So I think it's a really difficult dilemma, but I think understanding the situation is the first place to arrive at, and we'll bring back a report on the basic backlog of maintenance.
Okay, thanks, John. Councillor Hay.
Thank you, Chair. I would just like to go back to the background to this paper. I mean, say we adopted Building Bulletin 103 space standards way back in the autumn of 2019. And we've been told that was mainly because of financial need. At the time, there was insufficient time to consider the wider implications of the decision on teaching and learning and other council policies, such as those on the climate emergency. This was way back in autumn. Since then, have we had chance to look at the implications of this on teaching and learning and the climate emergency? Because the last thing I think any of us want to be doing is building schools that short way down the line, we are finding we are having to refit because they're not fit for purpose in view of the government's push on the climate change and what we need to do to put things right.
Yes, we have considered that, and we've included a couple of examples in the report. So we would specifically be using the flexibility to respond to things such as school organisation issues. Like, for example, if we take the size of a classroom of 55 square metres, that's designed for a class of 30. But as we know, in the primary sector in particular, not all classes are 30. If you consider some of the admission numbers and our own admissions protocol, where we regularly over admit up to say 30 to 34 in some circumstances, then, you know, we need that flexibility to respond to schools who find themselves or may find themselves in that position. There's also the need to think about inclusion in mainstream and what that might mean for a school. Some may require, you know, adult support within the classroom, need mobility around the classroom. Other schools may have high levels of intervention in the school and require more group spaces. So I think, yeah, we have considered that, and we would apply the flexibility to respond to those types of situations when we get into the briefing and design of a school or an extension, because we don't just say to schools, well, this is the standard template, this is what you're getting. We design a building within an overall area envelope, you know, and then we develop that design with the school to reflect their specific needs. So if you've got that BB 103 flexibility available to you, that's how we would use it to respond to what I've described as the teaching, learning and organisational needs. And those are just a few examples. There are going to be many more, but that's how we could use it.
Thank you for that. That's covered the teaching and learning aspect of my question, but you haven't really touched on the climate emergency and the policies that we're now adopting within Cambridgeshire to try and reduce the effects of global warming.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue with that is probably neither BB 103 or BB 98.9 would reflect the targets that are being set for us through the climate emergency policies of the county council. I think that needs a wholly new approach, and we're talking about NZEB, nearly zero carbon schools, so a new measure of sustainability. So I think that perhaps needs to be set aside from BB 103 and BB 98.99, the two standards, and that's where we've taken the approach we have on Alconbury Weald. Rather than think about it theoretically or in terms of design guides, etc., we're trying to work out work our way through the design process to think about how we meet the county council's new target by applying it to an actual live project, and then we'll know the costs of that, and also, you know, how the business case may stack up so that we can make that extra investment. So in a way, I think the new targets we've got on the climate emergency probably sit outside BB 103 and BB 98, because I think our policies are ahead of anything that's available nationally in terms of design guides.
In that case, I'd be very interested when we have worked out the costs, etc., on the Alconbury Weald, if that could be brought back to this committee so that we could see what the costs would be going forward for any new build to have that type of thing built into the design.
Yes, certainly. We're into the milestone process now, and I think the next milestone report where we will probably have greater information on costs will be in March this year. I think that's right, Alison. So we will be in a position to report back to members in the spring if that's what's required.
Yeah, what I was intending to do at the end of the milestone 2, and I'd already informed Councillor Bywater and Councillor Count that I'd go back to them, but I can share that wider. But what we're developing at the moment is what is included in what we would say the standard price of a project. So at what level of NZEB can we achieve within the current cost breakdown of a project? And what we're looking at is how we can, and how much money or how far we can push the boundary before A, we need to ask for more money, or B, that it becomes ridiculously over expenditure and what it achieves. So we're at the moment in the process of just trying to work out where we are sensibly and look at how we address that going forward on all of the school projects.
And that also comes out in the MS program, doesn't it? Ultimately,
yeah,
looking at the cost balances. But yeah, it is monitored by members, and ultimately, you know, if we need to bring it back to CYP committee, we can do that. John, did you want to come in there?
No, I think it covered Simon with the other answers, so sorry.
Okay, thanks. David Ambrose Smith, would you like to come in?
Yes, thanks very much. Hello, Ian.
Hi, David.
Nice to see you again. I'm sitting here quite smug, really, just having a £40 million investment in schools in Littleport. So very, very smug indeed. But from that, I have to say that your building and design partnership, I thought, worked very, very well with Littleport, and what you was able to do for us, very much appreciative. But going on, the building itself, the energy costs are the utility costs are extremely high. And I just wonder how we're going to measure that and look after that going forward. On top of that, these are more comments than really questions for you. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, the high specification of the plant and equipment that is used means that keeping this plant and equipment to a high level needs expensive professional individuals and companies. So that makes it extremely, costs going on, extremely difficult going forward. And then just looking at the build quality itself, we've got a wonderful buildings, just looking at them. But underneath there are some sort of hidden areas of poor build quality, which really continue to give the users problems ongoing, and with little redress back to the developer. So unfortunately, the users, the academy, and ourselves are actually having to take that on board ourselves. So that's a bit sad. So I mention that because the maintenance, what you've been talking about, is with the county buildings, but where you've got a leasehold, the maintenance down to the leaseholder. So how are we going to address poor quality there and ongoing maintenance? Can it all be left with the leaseholder? There's a number of issues, but mainly a statement, really. I just worry about the cost of going forward with expensive equipment which has to be maintained to very high standard by very, very capable individuals, professional business. That will cost money. But the high utility costs are also an extreme worry as well. Unaffordable in certain cases. I don't want an answer. That's fine.
No, I mean, I think one of the things we are aware of is it's and we're looking. If you recall, members, we came to the November meeting with our proposal to re-procure a local Cambridgeshire framework, and one of the things we are aware of, and you're quite right to mention it, David, is that some of the systems that are in place that deliver this sustainability, the heating systems, ventilation systems, etc., along with other features of the building which require ongoing maintenance, are more complex than what used to appear in school buildings. So we're looking, if we can, to, in the re-procurement of the framework, address that issue, and rather than hand over the building with a load of manuals for the operator to then just work with, etc., we're looking at something called, being an integral part of the framework, the design and build contract framework, something called soft landings, where once the building's finished, there'll be a bit of overlap, perhaps a year possibly, with the occupier of the building, and some hand holding and working together on maintenance, understanding the systems, commissioning the systems, understanding the systems, staff training. So you're right, it is an issue, and we've identified it as a wider issue, and it's something that we want to pick up within the new design and build contractor framework, and we're part of the procurement package when we look to go out to tender on that. So that's how we're going to seek to address it, perhaps have a more active role post handover, something called soft landings it's referred to in the industry itself.
Yeah, would that be contractual, may I ask? Would that be contractual? Because we supposedly had a soft landing at Littleport, but once I think everything had been signed off, not being too harsh, because it looked well looked after, but the developers seem to run away.
Yeah.
So we've been paying for a lot of maintenance.
Yeah, it would be contractual. What we'd seek to do is, when we have our mini competitions within the framework on those projects where we feel we'll need the soft landings approach, we'll include that in the spec, and they'll bid against that. So once the successful contractors on board, there'll be an expectation that they do deliver that approach.
That's encouraging. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. Alison, you raised your hand. Did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, as Ian says, we are aware that our buildings, the more you go towards all these newer environmental aspects, the more money it costs, generally, A, to provide, and B, to maintain. So we are very aware that at the moment The old school caretaker who used to just flick a switch on the boilers in the old days is not really. You need to be an almost qualified M&E engineer to understand the systems that we put in now. So we are looking to address that. The problem is that with the environment changes and with the NZEB requirements, more complex mechanical plant is going to be required in the future, and we've really got to look at that, you know, and balance those needs overall, because it's only going to get, in my simple mind, it's only going to get worse, the mechanical electrical input to buildings, the more that we improve their environmental credentials.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm going to move on to the recommendations. Councillor Hoy is going to be the last speaker. So, Councillor Hoy.
Yeah, it's just a quick one, really. I'm just going to say that we need to be a bit realistic here as well, because obviously having bigger classrooms does cost money. You know, the carbon neutral stuff we're doing is very expensive, as Alison's just pointed out, and DfE are constantly pressuring us to reduce costs. So we are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place with this, and I just think we need to obviously realise that as well, because it's not an easy situation that we're in.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll just before I go to the recommendation, just say my bit. Really, it's fine. It's striking that balance, and I guess having the BB 103 and the ability to have some flexibility, because there will always be negotiations in this process. There will always be that discussion, but we've got to strike a balance of the reality of what we want and what we can really afford and deliver. So that's my views on it, really. I do like the flexibility that we can have that sits behind this. There has been a mixed sort of views on this as we go into the recommendations. So it's really hard for me to sort of judge how we want to take the recommendations. Do we want to take it on block, or should we go through them all individually? Lucy?
So I'm happy with A, C, D, E and F, but I'm not happy with B. So that might make it slightly quicker if we just did 2. I don't know whether other people feel the same.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. If I take that as a proposal, then to look at A, C, D, E and F on the recommendations, if anybody's got any objections to that, we'll take those as the first recommendations, and then we'll go back to B. Okay, so anybody? Okay, so I'll take that then as a unanimous support of A, C, D, E and F. Now, if we just look at recommendation B, which is to reaffirm the decision taken in the autumn of 2019. If I go through individually, if you could just say for or against, please. So, Councillor Ambrose Smith.
For.
Councillor Downs.
Against.
Councillor Every.
For.
Councillor Hay.
For.
Councillor Hoy.
For.
Councillor Netzinger.
Against.
Councillor Simon Taylor.
For.
Councillor Whitehead.
I don't really think we've got any choice. I think we do have to adopt those guidelines, so I think it's 4.
Okay, thanks, June. Councillor Wisson.
For.
Councillor Andrew Reid.
For.
Flavio Vitesse.
For.
And myself, Councillor Bywater, 4. Okay, so that is a majority. Okay, so we'll take that noted as item B as a majority. Thank you very much, Ian and Alison. We'll now move on to item number 5, the school and early years funding arrangements. This report was published on Friday, the 15th of January and circulated electronically to all members of the committee on Friday afternoon. I accepted this as a late report on the following grounds. Councillor Downs, do you want to interrupt me?
Yes. Simon, could you ask the officers to screen share the documents they're talking about? It's very, very difficult to manipulate 2 computers to see you on one and the text on another, especially when the second computer, the Cambridge County Council computer, isn't working. So if you wouldn't mind asking the officers to screen share the documents they're talking about.
Michelle, can we do that? Can we show the agenda item number 5?
We don't normally do that, Chair, because this is streaming out to the public. So
yeah.
So they need to, yeah. So we did send the report separately. I know it causes some difficulties, but
I don't think there's a facility to do that,
that.
Councillor Downs, I'm afraid.
Well, I was hoping not to have to run off 142 pages of text, which I normally do. So I've got the county council computer on the left and this computer, my own computer in front of me. But I cannot get the county council computer to bring up the text. That is the problem. So I can't. I mean, I'm just listening to you talking with a great deal of admiration. I can't see a thing.
If it's helpful, Chair, I think the report will be introduced fully by Jonathan Lewis and Martin Wade, who will hopefully cover all the information within it.
Councillor Downs, it's a technical issue that I don't think we can address at the moment. Let's hear John Lewis and Martin when they present their report, and then ultimately you can ask any points really. But if it is a large document, and I don't think we'd even be able to share it on the screen anyway if there's 100 and something pages, so I think that's difficult. So I'll go back to my preamble. The reason for lateness for the report is in order to provide the committee with the most up-to-date information possible on the outcome of the disapplication request from the Department of Education and the recommendations made by Schools Forum at its meeting on the morning of the 15th of January. And the reasons for urgency, it is essential that this report is discussed at the committee today to ensure that the statutory deadline for submissions to the DfE on the 21st of January is met. Can I ask John Lewis, the Director of Education, and Martin Wade, Strategic Finance Business Partner, to introduce the report, please?
Thanks, Chair. And just to reassure Councillor Downs, so we'll try and avoid references to parts of the document and explain perhaps more fully what we're describing. So as described, we've reached the end of the 21-22 budget round. The paper we're presenting outlines the decision making that has happened over the autumn. Useful to remind you that the role of the local authority is to set the schools budgets for all schools in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, regardless of whether they're an academy or a maintained school. We have to consult Schools Forum, the representative body that consider finance issues for Cambridgeshire, on those proposals, and ultimately the decision on that final budget is ours today. I wish it was that simple and straightforward. I'm going to run you through some of the decision making that's happened, some of which you've heard before, but I'll just focus really on the key bits of the paper, and then we'll reach the sort of outcome that we believe as officers we wish you to endorse and sign up to. So the paper covers how the high needs block has changed. Obviously, we always wait for data. The information in the budgets are set on October, the October census count. The information in the report reflects the changes that have come through, both in terms of the change in pupil numbers, which have declined slightly in Cambridgeshire this year. The change in government policy, which we've seen a quite significant uplift in our funding, for which we're very grateful. Not enough, but we're still grateful for the uplift. And then obviously the decisions that we have to make about how that budget is allocated and the relative need in our funding formula between schools. So the report covers that. As I said, we do consult on these budget proposals. We've had to consider the whole of the DSG when we make our decisions. We'll cover very briefly early years funding later. The annual dilemma we have around the challenge on the high needs block, so that funding for children with SEND or additional needs, be it behaviour or other support needs, against the schools block has been a regular debate and dialogue. We originally made a proposal to Schools Forum to transfer 1% of the schools budget to the high needs block. That was rejected by Schools Forum. We presented to the Secretary of State our proposal to overrule the forum on that decision, because that is a decision we have to seek Secretary of State's approval to. We sent that in November, and last week we received confirmation that the Secretary of State for the second year running did not support our 1% transfer in funding. So the ongoing deficit in the high needs block, that will reach £28 million at the end of this year. We have seen an uplift in that budget, but we're likely to be in excess of, I would say, in the region of £38 million at the end of next year, if nothing would change. So the context I've shared with you previously, and you'll understand. Now, going on to section 4 of the report, if those of you that can follow, covers the sort of final proposals that we took forward. When we had finalised the overall budget, applied the national changes in the national funding formula, for the first time, I think, in Cambridge's history, we actually had a surplus in our funding, something called headroom, in our funding arrangements, whereby applying all the uplifts, changing pupil numbers, there was an amount of money left over, which equated to 634,000. Now, that was unexpected. There's a number of reasons behind that, some changes in pupil numbers, the way we support new schools, and some of the application around the changes in the formula meant that there was money left over. So we took as officers a paper to Schools Forum on Thursday, I think, last week, and Friday, and requested that instead of that money being added and spread across the funding arrangements, that we would seek a transfer of that money, it's about 0.18%, into the high needs block, to essentially offset the need to cut funding for education, health and care plans, which we've talked to you about previously, a 10% reduction to bring us in line with statistical neighbours. This is a temporary arrangement only. It will buy us some time for a year to obviously continue the debate. However, the reason for doing it is more around the instability in schools funding at the moment, the challenges of COVID, and the need to continue to provide support to our most vulnerable children. So we took that proposal through. We had a unanimous decision to support the local authority with that proposal. So instead of bringing lots of options to you in terms of the decision making you need to have made, and Martin's much more elegantly put this in the paper than I have, we have fully funded the formula. We've set our what we think is a realistic position around the minimum funding guarantee. We will transfer the 0.18% into the high needs block, and we sort of ask you to support that budget proposal that is in front of you and the allocations that are made in the appendix. Before we stop for questions, and I'm sure Martin will want to correct anything I've got wrong, there's a section in there on early years funding too. It's a separate pot of money that we receive. There was a national uplift of £44 million, which is modest to say the least. It's a very large sector. We've given you the rate changes that we put through, so it's an extra few pence on each of the areas going forward. I have to say we are extremely concerned about the early years sector. It's a sector driven by registrations and children that attend. We've seen a much lower take-up. We've seen a number of proprietors struggle with the cost of COVID and the implications behind closure. And we are at the moment looking at some plans and proposals to put additional funding into that sector, be it through the COVID grant or through the DSG, because if we do not sustain the sector, we will not meet our sufficiency requirements going forward. So that's not in the report. We've given you the sort of funding for next year. It's a positive story. It's better than it was the previous year, but the context of the sector is completely different from what it was a year ago, and we're very keen to support that sector. So I will make sure you have a briefing note on that proposal to allocate money, because I think it's important you see the scale and issue of challenge we face there. So I'll hand over to Martin. Is there anything, Martin, to clarify, or if not, we'll go on to questions?
Yes, I think you've covered most of it, John. So I think just a couple of points, just to say that what this does mean is that all of the schools will now receive the minimum per pupil levels, which are a statutory requirement from the DfE within the primary and secondary sector. And the rates that we'll be funding schools at, as shown in the appendix, will be those as set out in the national funding formula. So we've managed to, as John said, match that in full and fund that in full. However, that said, there will be still some schools who will see reductions in funding from year to year. There's quite a large number of schools who are seeing falling rolls from last year. And John briefly mentioned it, but we've actually, for the first time in a long time, seen a net reduction in the primary sector. So actually less children in the primary sector this last October than there were in October 2019. And we're seeing a significant kind of bulge coming through into the secondary phase, which will obviously have kind of longer term implications. One thing I did want to draw your attention to in Appendix A, in the note at the bottom, it says around the split site factor is £100,000. The actual correct figure for that is actually 93,000. Apologies, that is a mistype on my part on that one. Only other thing I just wanted to say around early years, John mentioned about the uplift in funding. The other positive bit of news we've had is around the maintained nursery school sector, where it's now been confirmed that the additional supplementary funding maintained nursery schools receive will continue for the 21-22 academic year as well, which that element of funding has been in question for a period of time, but that now has been confirmed for a further academic year for that particular sector. But I think you covered everything else, John.
Okay, thank you very much, gents. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. One of the issues, Jonathan, you thought, excuse me, was going to be a problem was that some of the schools that were going to miss out would be smaller schools. Is that still a problem? Have we still got funding issues with smaller schools? And I do find the paragraphs under 4.6 very disturbing. And do you have any comments about those? Sorry.
Okay, if I address first the issue with small schools, we've managed to do what we said we were going to do, which is meet the national funding formula. So that money has gone out. Small schools are undoubtedly under pressure. We still don't have the ability to target money at small schools. So even with that 600,000, if we were to allocate that out to the school sector, the majority of it would go on pupil numbers, because the majority of the funding arrangements are pupil number driven. So I don't think it changes the situation hugely. It's a relatively small amount, and arguably the impact of a 10% reduction on education, health and care plans would have a more higher detrimental impact on some of those schools. That's a generalisation. I can't say any more detail than that going forward. I'm just looking at the paragraphs you quoted, Joan. So 4.6, all schools release the minimum per pupil level. Is that the section you've got any challenge with, or can you just clarify? Because I think for Peter's...
Well, it's talking about the fact that it would appear that under these funding formulas that schools in poorer areas and more deprived areas are going to see less funding than those in wealthier areas. Yeah.
Well, I think
is very disturbing.
And I think we've included in the subsequent paragraphs the sort of national view that's come from some very interesting organisations that study schools funding that suggest that is the case. We've talked about this challenge before. We've done some work on this that we cannot tweak the national funding formula to represent that. It's driven by a range of factors that are not in our control. We don't control the data sets that allocate the money out. Is given to us. It's a real challenge, but equally, we need to remember this, is that we've had challenges with minimum funding for schools that are in affluent areas as well. So this is some of the rebalancing of the historic differences where certain schools were targeted with certain money, and that balance came through. And certainly, that floor on funding in Cambridgeshire is really important, given we have some very high levels of affluence, and that often hasn't generated enough money to deliver the basic infrastructure of a school. So I think...
So John, just to clarify, sorry, the more deprived schools will still receive more funding than the affluent funding. It's just that more of the new funding that's coming in, it's kind of levelling the playing field more, if you like, in terms of that. So what we're seeing is the increases in funding from year to year in the affluent schools are greater than they are in the deprived schools, because of the way that it's levelling up through the minimum per pupil levels. That should... Now that all schools are at the minimum pupil levels, we should see, if the funding continues next year, we should see that kind of differential kind of being maintained. But as it says, it is a worrying pattern in terms of how the funding is being allocated.
So can I just follow that up? So the motion to council about making representations to the Department of Education about the issue of lack of flexibility for councils has fallen on deaf ears, I presume, has it?
We've made a huge amount of representations around the failings in the funding arrangements over this last year. I think we've done 3 different approaches with that, and they're not willing to budge on the existing arrangements. There is a drive to move to a national formula, and at some point it's likely that the local authority will not have a role in setting local funding arrangements, which I think is an even more retrograde step around making sure needs are met locally. So it's unlikely to shift. There will be no doubt a consultation on arrangements for next year. We will continue to make the noise around it doesn't work for all schools. But then how do you individually fund 25,000 schools? I think that's a huge challenge nationally, but one we need to make sure that Cambridgeshire doesn't lose out on.
By having
Thanks.
more local control.
Thank you.
Is the answer.
Thank you. Peter Downs, please. Peter, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We could have a very long debate and we'll take up time now about the fact that it is actually better to have the funding that we've got now than what we used to have many years ago when we were local schools children were dependent upon the whim and the decision of the ruling group, and that was not terribly favourable. However, my question is about the 38 million deficit in high needs. Now, we need to know what the impact of that is for the council as a whole, because you can't just go on and on increasing the deficit. There must be some point where you say enough is enough. The fact it's a national problem doesn't solve it for us. We are, I think I told you the other day, the 7th worst in this respect in the whole country as a proportion of our budget. We have the 7th highest deficit, and you're just proposing to increase it further next year. But where does it end?
Well, just to point out, we may be 7th in the league table, but the DfE officials are telling us our activity and approach is in line with their expectations, and the activity is correct for the needs of our children. So
I don't deny that. I don't deny that.
Just think it's useful to put that against that figure, because we're doing what we should be doing, and the costs are higher than we are funded. When I spoke to the DfE, had a phone call from them to tell me the application had been rejected. I did point out, though, I asked for a recognition of why and an explanation. We haven't received that. I was just told it had been declined. So it'd be interesting to know whether there's a rationale of why they think Cambridgeshire can continue to build a deficit, because our proposal was that wasn't going to be the case. I've also reiterated, and I think we're on our 4th request now, that the cash flow situation, and obviously at the moment, at the end of this financial year, we'll be £28 million in deficit. So we're borrowing essentially, or we have an opportunity cost of £28 million, is borne by the council taxpayer. And why are they not advancing us funding to balance this off? That's somewhere, and we will update this figure. And it changes obviously because interest rates have changed or investment returns have changed. That's in the region of 500,000 to 700,000 a year that is being lost to the authority. So I've got another contact. I will write again. We were told they were too busy with COVID to respond to the last 2 attempts, and I did point out, well, we're too busy responding to government guidance. That was very calm with the way I responded to that. We're too busy responding to government guidance to actually deal with it. It's a ridiculous situation. There has been some changes in the accounting regulations to support how deficits are held in the balance sheet. So, our accounts will not be, challenged on the strength of this deficit, which is an interesting perspective. Nevertheless, we've got to do something about it because it's just building. But our hands are tied at the moment. We're trying to make changes. It's not the right time to be consulting or cutting support to children. And I'm very grateful that Forum supported us to give us that money to buy us some time. But we need to now go back to government and say, come on, government, tell us what we need to do, because I think we're at that point now.
Thanks, John. Councillor Netzinger, please.
Thank you. It follows on exactly on the high needs block funding stuff, and I absolutely share your extraordinary frustration with this situation, John. It's just impossible. I think you said earlier in your when you were speaking that the deficit is currently at 28 million, and unless something changes, is likely to be 38 million by the end of the year. Obviously, there are things that we will try and do to make sure that it's not 38 million by the end of the year. Some of those will have an impact on the quality of education that and support that families of children with EHCPs get, presumably. But my question really is that the money that you've got now, the extra little bit, which I think you said was 634,000, that doesn't seem very much in the overall context of that deficit. So how much difference will that make is that likely to make to the potential 38,000 deficit that we will be running that you
38 million
by the end of the year.
Yeah. So just to explain the figures, and sorry, we're talking about next financial year in the paper, and I've kind of linked it to this year. So at the end of this financial year, 2021 financial year, be a £28 million deficit. Depending on what happens, we're predicting if we carry on spending the way we have spent, changes there, the end of the 21-22 financial year, we'll have a deficit of £38 million. So it's an extra 10 million burn in year, Martin. I might be a little bit off there, but I'm just giving you some indicative figures. One of the savings that we've had through our SEND recovery actions was looking at the amounts of funding that was going into EHCP top-ups and saying that actually we do fund slightly higher than the national average. And if you ever ask any head teacher whether we fund enough, and they'll every time tell us it's nowhere near what the costs are, which we don't disagree with. But one of the savings measures, we were going to bring that down by 10% to bring us in line with statistical neighbours. So we were looking at other authorities and their spend. I think that netted would save about 1.4 million, roughly in that sort of area. So the 634,000 that comes through essentially saves us a term and a bit's worth of having to make those changes. You know, we would have to have consulted in the spring term. We probably would have looked to implement those changes probably in September, maybe in late summer. So the 634,000 buys us some time to obviously have those conversations with government, look at other options until probably January 2022. So, you know, we feel that way schools will be in a better place in terms of decision making. Their budgets will be more static, and hopefully COVID is a thing of the past by that time. So that's what the proposal is linked to. It doesn't match exactly. It will still be a hit on our finances, but given that there was a sort of windfall and a need, that is how we asked for the money to be allocated. It's probably slightly higher cost-wise.
Okay, if I can just come back. So you are still expecting that deficit will be 38 million by the end of the next financial year?
Somewhere in that region of that, yeah.
And I understand that it will change slightly depending on which children come in and move and all sorts of other things. We are not the only local authority to be in this position. From what I've heard nationally, I mean, 38 million is on the high side in comparison with other local authorities, but I think it's not the highest. Presumably we are working with other local authorities through the LGA to put, I mean, I know that there's pressure on this, but it is, I mean, the number of authorities that have a deficit of that scale, I believe, is relatively small. So I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about what you're doing with other people.
So obviously Peter represents us with F40. They've made strong representation through that group. We've written to the LGA and asked for their support around these issues.
I believe you've had. I think, I think that's there, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've spoken to the MPs who have made representations to the Secretary of State. So we wrote a letter for them to send on to highlight those issues. And we were promised there would be a review of high needs funding, and it's now drifted another year going forward. In terms of where we sit relatively, you know, we are relatively high, but there are some authorities that have a much bigger deficit relative to the percentage of the budget. So some London boroughs, for instance, we believe are over 100% of their high needs budget in deficit. You know, our 28 million as it stands now is a third of our spend. You know, it's not great, but it's a relatively different measure. You know, cash wise, you know, we're a shire county, so we're going to be larger than other areas. So various different figures out there, and I don't think we can deny it's a problem, because it is. I think from what I picked up through my networks is the majority of local authorities, and I'm talking significantly over 50% here, are in deficit now. You know, fortunately, my other hat on with Peterborough, we're not. So it's just quite an interesting context and, you know, driver behind it, and shows perhaps how the funding formula doesn't necessarily work, because I don't think we do anything different between Cambridgeshire and Peterborough particularly. So
that's really
thank you, John. There's nobody else who's got their hand up. As chair, I just want to say a couple of things really. Is also just to thank the Schools Forum, because they have the same dilemma as us when it comes to making these decisions, and it's extremely tricky. So I can appreciate the difficulty that they've had making the decisions. Anybody worth their salts who's watched this progress of schools funding over the last 3 or 4 years will see it's on a path of self-destruction, so to speak, because it's unsustainable. It will not, we just will not and cannot carry on like Peter Downs has highlighted. Yes, it's great. We're grateful to receive the funding we've had, but it is unsustainable in my opinion. And I just finally want to thank John, Lewis and Martin, because you've battled with this. You know, you've really pushed back to government about our concerns as a local authority about where we are and where we're going. So, you know, as Chairman, thank you very much for that. Members, it's always difficult to come to voting on this, but I see the recommendations in front of us. I don't sense anybody opposing the recommendations that we've got here, but if anybody has, would they like to signal now in the raising their hands? Otherwise, I'll take it as a unanimous decision to the recommendations. Okay, so I don't see anybody opposing that, so we'll take that as unanimous. And John and Martin, thank you very much. Okay, so we'll move on now to agenda item 6, the finance monitoring report. Martin, can you just stay with us and introduce the report, please?
I can indeed, Chair. So, no significant changes to the position to the end of November from that position that we reported previously to the end of October. In fact, there's an overall slight improvement to the bottom line for the areas which this committee has responsibility. I think, as we've mentioned at the last couple of committee meetings, we are now starting to see an increase in the children care placement costs as the numbers are coming through. It's not actually an increase significantly in numbers, but it's more the complexity of need and then the costs of those more complex places that we're seeing. And we do expect that is potentially going to rise over the remainder of the current financial year. And then obviously lead us into next year as well. However, on the flip side, we are seeing some increasing underspends elsewhere within children's and safeguarding, which will hopefully offset some of the increase that we are likely to see. One specific thing I did want to draw attention to was in respect of overnight and residential short breaks. Commissioning colleagues have now put in place section 256 agreement with the CCG for the provision of overnight and residential short breaks, which has recently been brought back into the control of the County Council. Although the actual transfer of funding itself is not new, the actual agreement of £350,000 per year for the next 2 years secures funding from health specifically into the service for those children with complex needs. So I think that's a positive kind of step forward to have that agreement in place. Last thing just to mention really is around in terms of COVID related costs. Again, we're not necessarily seeing a significant increase in costs specifically related to COVID. Obviously, we mentioned last time at the meeting around the income or loss of income specifically in some of the areas in John's services. For next month, you'll see that we've actually now received a specific grant from the MHCLG, which actually does reimburse us for some of that lost income, which again is a positive step forward, and that will be reflected in future reports to this committee. As I say, no real significant changes from previous months. So if there are any comments or questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Martin. Councillor Whitehead, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just want some reassurance, I think, about page 25, paragraph 2.1.8, where we've got this problem of overspends in services which normally schools would pay for. I just want some assurance that we are going to be able to absorb those overspends, because clearly those services are going to be needed once schools get back to normal. So I just want some assurance that those overspends are copable with and that we can carry them and without actually reducing the service or the staff within those services in the short term.
So just purely from a sort of a financing perspective, as I kind of just briefly mentioned, there is some additional grant that we've now received from the MHCLG. So we've effectively claimed for a proportion of that lost income. So that will help offset, some of those lost income going forward. And so that will be reflected in future reports. In terms of individual services, a number of them have managed to offer different delivery models, whether it be virtual or other ways of offering services to schools. I think, John, I don't know if you've got any more to say about some of the more problematic areas.
No, just to say, Joan, I've been really well supported by the council. We're not looking to cut anything. At this stage, the schools have understood. Some of them have paid for services remotely. We've got to restart education, and we will obviously look at service redesign for any other reason. But at the moment, COVID is not the driver behind any of that. So I'm really positive about the support I've had.
Thank you.
And I could just touch on, it talks about the outdoor centres there and the £1.2 million overspend. There's a programme board that monitors that. The staff have been working really hard to minimise costs, and ultimately we're being subsidised by the government grant as well. So it will be interesting to see how those figures pan out as we move forward, as Martin suggested, really. So although it looks quite horrendous, by the time we get the compensation from the government and the expenditure decrease that's obviously not happening, obviously we're not paying for the food and all the other expenditure, hopefully it will get closer to a much better position, really, as because that's worst case scenario at the moment, my understanding, Martin.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, I can't see any other questions, and so we'll move to the recommendations. It's just a note and comment. So unless anybody's got any objections, we'll take that as carried unanimously. Okay, thank you, Martin, as ever. We'll now move on to agenda item 8, which is the determined admissions. I believe Karen Beaton is going to introduce this report. Am I right? There she is. Hello, Karen.
Hi everybody. Thank you for inviting me today. I'm Karen Beaton. I'm the strategic manager for admissions and attendance for Cambridgeshire. I'm here to, I believe we've had a report on determined admissions arrangements for 2022 to 2023. Just a little bit of a background. Each year as a local authority, we have to develop a qualifying scheme for the transition of children to both primary and secondary school. The scheme ensures that we meet the expected regulations around the coordination of admissions arrangements. However, if there is an occasion that changes to the admissions arrangements are required, we do have the ability to, through some statutory processes that involve advance notices and consultations, we can make changes to that. One of the changes that requires a consultation is that of a decrease in the published admissions number, or the PAN, of community and voluntary controlled schools. So therefore, according to the regulations, a consultation took place in terms of a reduction of PAN for Buick Ridge, Burwell, Westfield Junior. Now, we received no objections or comments were received at all. So therefore, I'm here this afternoon to ask the committee's approval of the changes, and that will allow the school's adjudicators to be informed as is required. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. Could I just ask a question myself, really? How widely was it advertised? So, because it's quite unusual for no objections or comments to come in.
Yeah, it was advertised on the webpage, and it's advertised for a specific amount of time. I think that's within the report it was sent through. And the request is engaging parents, primaries, and schools and other interested partners.
Okay, thank you very much. Members, Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you. Yes, it follows on from what you've just said, John. I don't quite understand why we've got these reductions in PAN numbers, particularly Berwick Bridge Community Primary School, which has going to half its numbers. I mean, what is the reason for these reductions in numbers?
Okay, there can be several reasons. One of the most prominent reasons is actually a reduction in the number of children that have been applying for the local schools. Variation requests have been seen for that particular reason, not just in Cambridgeshire, but also nationally as well. I mean, I don't know if you'd be interested, but the Schools Adjudicator recently did a report on that, about the number of primaries that were seen downsize due to reduction in the local cohort that's applying for particular schools. So I think that's one of the main reasons.
It just seems huge that this school is going down to half its number. Is it going to be viable in the future as a school then?
Yes, certainly that's taken into consideration when we're looking at the PAN. And as I say, the consultation took place with the community as is required.
Hazel, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I suppose it's just to add to what Karen has said, and to reassure Joan, this is something we obviously do keep under review. If circumstances change, then we work with schools and we will increase published admission numbers going forward. So it is as a response, as Karen has said, to changing demographics in that part of the city, in the Cherry Hinton area. But yes, I mean, obviously, you know, our main concern is obviously educational viability of the schools, and we've got no reason to have any concerns about that particular school as a result of this change.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hay, please.
Yeah, I have a query again about one of the schools reducing their PAN. Westfield Junior School. If I remember rightly, it was only last year that we were asked to approve something in the region of 15 million for a new joint junior and infant school on this site. And yet now we're being asked to approve a reduction in PAN. You know, it doesn't seem to follow on what we were asked to do last year and what we're asked to do now.
Hazel, could you answer that question for me, please? I'm still fairly reinforced with that historic information.
Hazel, come in, please.
Yeah. You're right, Councillor Hay, in terms of the history. As you rightly recall, we were considering brokering an amalgamation between the partner infant and the junior school. At that, you know, originally we were considering the need for 3 forms of entry across those 2 schools. Subsequent to that, again, a further review of the demographic need in that catchment area in St Ives identified the need for fewer places, and that the schools providing 420 in total between them would meet current and forecast need going forward. And it was largely as a result of that change in the demographics which led to the 2 governing bodies taking the decision not to proceed with the amalgamation proposals. They elected to remain as separate infant and junior schools.
Thank you very much for that clarity. Any other members with questions for Karen or Hazel on the report? Okay, no, I can't see anybody else. I can't sense any objections, so we'll look to the recommendations then as a block. And anybody got any objections? If they raise their hand function now, otherwise I'll take them as unanimous. Okay, so that's carried as unanimous. Thank you very much, Karen and Hazel, for that. Members,
sorry, Chairman, I think you've missed a report, item 7.
You're absolutely right, because I was just going to ask if anybody spotted my deliberate mistake. I missed John's report, and I don't know how I could have done that, but we jumped ahead to item 8, but we're going to now pull it back a little bit to John's report, item 7. The service director's report. So, John, I'm sorry to have missed you, but we're back to you.
That's all right. I was going to make myself a cup of tea, but I'll stay and deliver this one. Okay. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm conscious there has been a member briefing, but there's a fairly full report there that does explain the current situation with COVID. So and where we are with schools and school results more generally. So I will just highlight, the challenges that we've had, probably starting, the couple of days after Christmas, getting schools reopened following union concerns, the closure of schools, the reopening of schools for critical and vulnerable workers, some of the challenges we've had with government guidance and or therein lack of guidance has been significant for us. What I can say though at this stage is that I think our schools have and earlier settings have been tremendous in their response. Our numbers in schools are reasonable and appropriate. All our measures are above national, not hugely, particularly around the overall pupil numbers, but the number of vulnerable children attending, the number of social work children attending, and meeting the needs of critical worker children I'm very pleased with the outcome from that. So I think the advice and guidance that's been developed jointly with our Academy Trust, with our diocese, we're grateful Andrew's here to support us, and others, has made a difference. And I think we're running schools very appropriately at the current time. Obviously, the report covers results as well, so I've included in there key stage 4, 5, and destination data. We could spend an awful lot of time pulling this data apart and looking at it. I've given you the information. I think any comparability to last year is really challenging. Any comparability to the national position is really challenging. There's a series of algorithms that sit behind this. There's a series of teacher assessments that sit behind it. It's interesting information that at an individual school level is relevant, and for them to understand. But I felt for completeness and for your understanding to share that information was relevant, but actually relying on that data too much is really difficult. Obviously, what I would say is that at an individual pupil level, children had results which were in line with the expectation of the school, and I think that was a positive outcome. Obviously, there's a consultation happening now about next year, and I'll be more than happy to come back to you at a future date and explain to you what that means. So I'll leave it there. Obviously, there's an appendix that outlines the sort of more detailed issues around COVID. I've got something on the winter support grant, but I think I'll rather open up to questions, Chair, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thanks for all the stuff you've been doing and prior to this meeting as well, and all the information that you've been putting out to us. Members, any questions from members, please? No, I can't say. Oh, sorry, here we go. Councillor Hoy, please, and then Andrew Reid.
Yeah, I was going to just say, I don't think there's going to be a lot of questions, not because there's a lack of interest. I just think that it just shows just really how well briefed I think officers have kept everyone. I think that everyone knows what's happening because we're frequently being told this is what's going on. If there's any questions, they're always answered. So I think that that's actually just shows the fact there are so few questions is actually a good thing on this one, I think, because it just shows how well officers are doing in this area, really.
Yeah, absolutely spot on, Sam. Thank you very much. Councillor, sorry, Andrew Reid. Sorry, I cut you off, Andrew. Sorry.
Right, that's all. Just to reinforce what Councillor Hoy has just said, there was just one question though, which was the extent to which this committee can contribute to the debate regarding vaccinations for teachers, particularly with potential for return at some point after half term.
Yeah, it's a good point, Andrew. John, I'll let you come in. I think I see Wendy's also got a hand up. Yes, absolutely. A very valid point that a lot of members have been pushing on. So Wendy, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Andrew, for that. So just so you know that regionally, the Director of Children's Services, DCSs, including myself, are lobbying hard for teachers. And we'll continue to do that. And I will, through John, keep you updated, but we keep pushing for it, Andrew, and we won't stop doing that. We realise how important it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I could add to that, Chair, we did have a bit of a false start. We were very hopeful that we would have vaccinations available to the sector yesterday. Unfortunately, some miscommunications happened there, but obviously, we continue to raise the profile, make sure they are supported. And the good thing about it is we have Head Start now because we're ready to go with any vaccination that does roll out. So some members may have heard of that situation, but unfortunately, the situation has moved on today, and we are now waiting for that government direction of what happens next with vaccinations in education.
Yeah, and I echo that. Apology for the little bit of confusion, that sort of the mixed messaging, but it's clear now that we want to push this agenda, and we'll do what we can. Councillor Netzinger, please, and then Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you. I was slow putting up my hand because I was deeply absorbed looking at the GCSE and A-level data, which actually we haven't had in our other briefings, and is really interesting. But I did want to pick up on the point that Sam made and sort of say that actually on the COVID situation, a huge thank you to John and his team for the really excellent briefings that councillors have got, and I know the support that schools have had from that team. I think it's really worth saying in this public forum, because there's been a lot of discussion in our private briefings, but I think it is worth saying in this public forum that the County Council has had to work incredibly closely with schools to support them in what has been an unbelievably difficult situation for head teachers, for teachers, and really, really importantly, also for parents. I think the situation that happened over Christmas with schools, first of all, being told on the last day of term of just before Christmas that they were going to have to be responsible for testing children starting at the beginning of January, put incredible stress and pressure on heads over the Christmas break, which was really unhelpful given how exhausted the whole education community was after a term when they've been managing bubbles, managing kids coming in and out of school. So that in itself was really unhelpful. To then have the whole fiasco of children will be going back, schools are really safe, oh no, they're not really safe, no one's going back, you've all got to home educate your children. That whole turnaround was really difficult for parents and for teachers. And I didn't want to, I mean, we've discussed this in private meetings. I think it is important that it's acknowledged in this public meeting, and that the work that schools and teachers have done in order to get online learning up and running so quickly has been amazing. And I have to say that as someone whose daughter is busy doing online learning in the class in the room next door, the quality of the online learning that is being rolled out by schools is so much better than it was in the summer. It's really, really impressive. I know there are still difficulties with laptops and with data access for some pupils, but what teachers have achieved is extraordinary, and I think it's really important that we put that on the record, but that we also put on the record just how difficult that it has been for parents, having to suddenly switch to trying to work from home and supervise home learning, and that we do understand that is incredibly hard. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Lucy. Points well made. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Chair. It's a small point, but I'm on paragraph 3.2 on page 71. I've read it several times, and I think there's a mistake in it. It says 94% of the Cambridgeshire end of Key Stage 4 cohort were in sustained education or employment in line with levels seen nationally and regionally. At district levels, the figures vary from 93% in Fenland to 5% in South Cambridgeshire. You're saying that South Cambridgeshire, which I think has the highest levels of achievement, has only got 5% of pupils in sustained education and employment.
Let me.
Surely that's not right.
No, it's not, Joan. Let me get you the right figure. Sorry, that's probably a mistake.
All right,
hastily put together. I'll clarify that if you want to go on to the next point. I've got the report.
That's the point. The only point I was going to make.
So I'll come back. I'll see if I can find it now. But if I can't, I will certainly correct it.
It just might be worth altering the report before it goes any further.
No, I will definitely do that. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Every, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to add my thanks to everybody else's to John, because not only are the schools and the teachers working really hard, but this is a thank you from the governors who are still required to do monitoring of schools and of the quality of what's going on, which is quite difficult for many of us. And there was a fantastic briefing yesterday that John gave and the rest of the governance team. And I would just like to thank you for continuing to look after us as well.
Well, thank you. I think Governor's had a really difficult role actually in this. There's been a lot of operational leadership going on. We haven't always been able to do the strategic side, which is the role of the governors. But the support that's gone in, particular around supporting the mental health and well-being of leaders in schools, has been invaluable. So, I think it's all part of one big team, really, this effort to address those challenges that we've had. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Every. Councillor Hoy.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention as well someone that no one has actually mentioned yet today, which is the children themselves, because actually this has been awful, absolutely awful for them. And I haven't got children myself, but obviously I've got friends and family, and they all say how just devastated their kids were, and they don't know whether they're coming or going, because one minute you're told you're going back to school and seeing your friends, the next minute you're not going back to school, and that for themselves is really difficult. And I think that's for children that perhaps live in a stable home environment, and they're obviously struggling. So I imagine it's even harder for those that are perhaps living in a less stable environment. And I remember reading a statistic, apparently calls to Childline have, I think, gone through the roof over the last few months. And I really do worry about some of the children's mental health and things like that we're going to be finding coming through, because I think that this is actually going to do some real long-term damage for children. And I think this committee really needs to, obviously there's not much we can perhaps do now, but I think we do need to, going forward in the future, look at that, because I think it's a real worrying problem.
Well, I think you're absolutely right to raise that. We have put out a huge amount of support information. So just this week I sent out a poster to schools around the health support that's there for secondary age pupils and around mental health and avenues to go down. I think we'll probably lead quite nicely into Lou's report next time, because the implication of some of those challenges plays its way out in the wider children's services angle. And I don't think we can it's really hard to judge the impact right now, because we've kind of stopped and started. And the tail on this, without a doubt, will be here for many, many years to come. I think from a standards perspective, that's going to take my effort for a long time. And I think the social impact is obviously going to be significant for both of us, but principally for Lou as well. So I think it's a point where well made, and maybe that's something we need to bring back to the committee on a regular basis. What's changing and how do we know the impact and what we're doing about it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a really good point of talking about. Let's not forget that that's what we're here for, isn't it? And the outcomes of young people. Look, you've all said some really good things here, and I've been quite close to John on this journey, especially after Christmas. I don't think I've experienced anything quite like it in relation to maybe being as flexible as we have been. I mean, it's been absolutely fantastic to witness our education leads, heads, CEOs. From 1 minute we're briefing them one way, and then literally 12 hours later we're briefing another way. So yes, I often have myself scratching my head and thinking what we're doing. So brilliant effort to everybody. Keep it up, and we'll move to the recommendations. So, and that is just really to note and comment as appropriate, which is what we've done really. So we'll take that as carried, and we'll move on to the next item.
So, okay, sorry, Simon, can I just briefly interrupt? Joan, the figure is 95% for South Cambridgeshire. It was the highest sustained rate. 93 was Fenland, so the average 94 in the middle. So thank you, sorry.
Okay, thanks, John. Thanks for that clarity. Okay, members, we'll now go on to item number 9, which is to consider elective home education. John Lewis, it's over to you again, I believe, isn't it?
I'm hoping our expert Karen is here to.
Oh, sorry, Karen. Yes.
Yeah, I'll be back in a bit. Right behind you, Karen.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I think we've probably all had a chance to read the report that I've sent through on elective home education and the accompanying data. Just an overview. The background to the report was actually instigated by an outcome of requests from members. Looking at the dynamics of our EHE cohort, and certainly in light of the huge impact that COVID had on increasing numbers recently. Just a little reminder that obviously I'm sure you're all aware of that EHE is a legal right of a parent, and they can assume full responsibility to educate their child at home. I must admit, what we've seen over the last decade is undoubtedly a huge rise in numbers year on year of children being home educated. There's a variety of reasons for this, many environmental factors, but certainly what we've seen year on year is a report about dissatisfaction with the school environment. And obviously as well, recently, again, it's going to skew the figures, but the impact of COVID as well. Not only are we seeing an increase, but we've seen a churn of the parents that are home educating their child, not in the long term and not necessarily as an informed decision, but certainly periods of shorter amount of time of home educating. So the report that I've sent through reflects, hopefully, and gives you insight into the changing cohort, and draws attention to those more vulnerable families and families who require, not perhaps, but do require more information, advice and guidance on the decisions that they're making. So therefore, what I'm doing is I'm asking the committee to provide support for the compulsory registration system. And as I've alluded to in the report, this is a recommendation that's come out from the Education Committee, who called evidence from all local authorities just before Christmas, and indeed have put forward the need for a registration system, as well as an opportunity to reflect and review on the quality of education being provided. I must admit as well that one of the real areas I'm very keen on is when a parent does want to home educate and they make that decision to home educate, they are registered. As part of that registration process, schools are obliged at that point to inform the local authority before a child is off-rolled, so that where required, if a parent needs support, advice and guidance, local authorities are well able then to be able to intervene positively in their decision making. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Firstly, thank you very much for putting this report together, because I think your members remember that I did ask for this, and thanks for your support for getting this paper in front of the committee. This is an issue that's come up at the Regional Lead Members Network for the LGA. You know, so all local authorities are looking at this. And I guess it is about understanding the concerns about people that I describe as probably falling off the radar or not being on our radar, really. And it's certainly not to lock horns with the people who are home educating. I think there's some really good practices going on here. This is purely about potentially those individual children that will slip under the radar, that I think is important that we've got a responsibility to keep some sort of contact with, or some idea of who they are. I'll go to members now. So Simone Taylor, please, you're first.
Thank you, Chair. Just wanted to really touch on, I had an opportunity to speak with two parents who home educate in Cambridgeshire. One of them, well, I sent them the report to consider and to comment on, and one of them had already sent evidence of to the home ed consultation, I think it was last year, which some of the comments from, I'm going to sort of say out today. Can you hear me all right? Because I'm getting an echo.
Yes, carry on, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, so the sort of their sort of feel, not, you know, these are two different people. One of their feelings, they're saying that the LA inspections appear to be box ticking exercises with no benefits to home education families in return. There was part of the report that this parent sent into the consultation stating about the select committee. I think it was Graham Stewart. He said that if local authorities want families to register, they need to offer a concrete a concrete incentive. Otherwise, it'd be quite reasonable for families to prefer to ignore them. The parent that wrote this into the, to the consultation agreed, as their time and energy is best employed serving their children's educational needs and not the local bureaucracy. One of the parents said, most people I know who are home educated are not against the register, but are worried what else would come with it, like e.g. expectations to meet requirements that schools have to meet. They said they're okay with the annual form that the LA send in, so they fill out. A lot of parents worry, as home ed gets so much bad press by people that don't understand it. there is a lot of comments. One of them about again the perception that people have with homeschooling, especially by the media. The response tends to remain surprised that it exists, and people have concerns over the safeguarding, as we do. There was a comment on the report 4.4. One of the comments was, homeschooling during COVID is nothing like home ed. Although everyone does it differently, the majority wouldn't try and recreate school at home. We have also had to change what they do as groups because during the lockdown, because they've not been able to run as groups. In regards to 5.1, someone said in a local online group in Cambridgeshire, we are lucky to have a great relationship with our LA, and apparently pre-COVID, there were regular meetings between the two. But they get the feeling that not all local authorities are the same. Another comment was, I never registered, as no benefit to me. I did attend one of, I presume it's yourself, Karen, one of Karen's liaison meetings, and would have engaged more if any practical support was offered. And I think the last one is on exams. I think there's a lot of worry about the exams. They're having huge problems accessing exams. So one of the groups, they formed the Home Education Qualification Association, and they've talked to Ofqual and Pearson's. So there's a lot of comments there to think about, but absolutely, these are the ones that maybe don't have the safeguarding issues. So it's that fine balance, because we don't want to make the people that are doing this uneasy about what they're doing.
Absolutely.
Just to let you all know, Simon's having some computer issues. He's crashed. He's going to try and get back in. So I'll take over from now. Karen, did you want to come back to that, please?
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of points there, and if I miss some out, please remind me, and I'll try and include that in the feedback. I would start off with the relationship that we have with the home educated community in Cambridgeshire and the offer that we've pulled together. That is probably, I would suggest, a slightly better offer than you would find in other local authorities, but I'm not suggesting it's perfect. So we do, and we have worked really hard with our relationship over the last 8 years. Regular meetings, obviously COVID stopped that, but equally as well, a development of a local offer that meets some of the requirements of that community. In particular, we looked at GCSE funding, and we do support the home educated community access funding up to £300 for GCSE results. If I link that into the issue that they've had this last year with the exams, it was an appalling situation that the home educated community found themselves in, and I'm really pleased to announce that on Friday there was updated announcement from Ofqual and the Department of Education, and a consultation that I think it finishes on the 29th of this month, that is around not just the home educated community, the wider community, but does provide solutions. So we should be able to, the home educated community should be able to access those exams this year. I think our current offer also is one of information, advice and guidance. We're working with health at the moment to improve the access to mental health wellbeing websites and support, and we support with immunisation and lots of other things. We are on hand to offer advice and guidance. We are more reflective, and we will talk to the community, and in particular if there are parents that are having concerns or issues, we try and support those with offering one-to-one support through some of the resources that we have within the local authority. With regards to the annual information provision that we request from the community, I can understand how some people feel that it's just something that we need to do, and indeed we do have to do that. We are required with the new guidance updates in 2019 to obtain information on a regular basis. But what we often find is an awful lot of really, really interesting insight into the length and the quality of the provision that a lot of those young people out there are receiving. And that allows us as a local authority to have more of an insight into the different types of home education. And as we move forward, to help us continue to develop our offer to that community. And I'm looking forward again to getting back to meeting with them regularly. I can keep going on. Is there anything else? Can I ask the councillor what other aspects that she fed back that I've missed or require me just to cover? Because I think there was quite a lot there and I wouldn't want to not answer them.
No, Karen, I mean, I just picked out bullet points from what the two parents gave me. There is a long list. It might be worth me talking to you separately and on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, members. I suddenly decided to crash my computer for some reason. Councillor Hoy, do you want to come back in? Sorry if I'm interrupting, if you've taken charge of it.
No, that's fine. It's Councillor Whitehead next to speak.
Councillor Whitehead, over to you.
I think as some people will know, chaired the Children and Young People's Committee between 2013 and 2017. And those of you who are on it during that period may remember that we had a discussion about this issue at that committee, which turned out to be really quite tempestuous. We had a big delegation of articulate middle-class parents who were indignant that anybody should even seek to suggest that they should register themselves as home educating their children. And really, it's trying to explain that the issue is not about them, about their issues. It is about the children who fall through, as Simon has said, fall through the cracks. We did discover in part of our investigation for that meeting that all you are legally required to do is register the birth of your child. You do not have to register with a GP, and of course you don't have to register that you are home educating. And in fact, what that committee did decide to do was to lobby the Department of Education to have a system whereby people had to register that they were educating their children at home. And this was very strongly supported by the Safeguarding Board at the time, who also joined us in sending forward this submission. I think, Lucy, you may have been there, and I think, Simon, you may have been there at the time when this was discussed. Therefore, I am absolutely delighted to see that there should be a registration, that parents should be required to register that they are educating their children at home. Because it isn't about the articulate middle classes, it is about children who are suffering neglect, abuse, and issues of that kind. Because at the time that meeting was discussing, there was an issue of a child, I think it was in Wales, who nobody knew anything about, who was discovered in a situation of severe neglect. So I really hope we will support this proposal for a compulsory registration system and send it off with a fair wind, because I do feel it is long overdue and it is really, I feel, our duty to protect all the children in Cambridgeshire. And that includes knowing where they are and who they are. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Whitehead. I don't know who's first, Councillor Netzinger or Councillor Hoy. So I'll go Lucy, and then Sam, you can come in after. Thanks.
Thank you. So I totally agree with what Joan has just said. I do think that the register is necessary. I wish it wasn't, but I think it is necessary. I do remember and have had experience in other forums, more national forums, that there is certainly a group of the elective home education parents who are absolutely adamant that this is not something that's necessary. But I am happy to support all those recommendations. I actually wanted to focus on the report at 2.1 and 2.2, because actually, I mean, I think this is a really, really helpful report. And I think that for me, actually, the most crucial points of it are in 2.2, where it talks about the elective home education cohort has fundamentally changed. And there's been a move away from the traditional home educators who were home educating because it was absolutely a lifestyle choice and what they wanted to do. And there are now increasing numbers of parents who are home educating because they feel they have no option, because the school system is failing their children. The number of people in the graph above who have reported health and emotional health, dissatisfaction with the school, bullying, and a breakdown of relationships between the school and parents. I think that those are really, really serious issues that we as the Children and Young People must take seriously, and look at what it is that is contributing to that increasing number of parents who are keeping their children out of school because they feel that the school system is not serving those children. And I must say that I'm very concerned about this, partly because the conversation that we were having earlier about the support available for children with education, health and care plans, and the fact that we are being forced by government to try and find reductions in the support that we can give those children is likely to make this even worse. So I'm very pleased to see this report. I will support all the recommendations, but I think there are things that we need to be seriously concerned about, and we must come back to this at some point in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon's been kicked out again, so back to me. I had a question actually though as well, Karen, and actually it's very similar to what Lucy's just said, because I don't actually know too much about this issue, and I was quite interested reading the paper, and it struck me that it was quite shocking that the amount of people that take their children out of home traditional education because of bullying or dissatisfaction. And I wondered if that's something that perhaps we could look at through the Educational Achievement Board, as to see what can be done about that, because it's, you know, it's not nice if someone feels that they can't send their child to school because of various issues. So it'd be nice to address that really somehow.
I think one of that'd be good. If I can respond, if that's okay. I mean, that's one of the greatest frustrations we have when we're sitting looking at the deregistration forms, is the lack of opportunity to get in before the child's off roll. I mean, when we have the opportunity to mediate between a school and the parent, often we can get that child to be kept on school roll, and just allocating our resources appropriately to make sure that that child and the school and the parent reflect on that child's needs appropriately. So that's why within the registration system, to have that aspect of off-rolling and schools having to inform a local authority before they off-roll, particularly vulnerable young people, I think that's an absolutely essential part of what we would be hoping in the future.
Okay, thanks, Karen. I see Simon's back. We're just going to go to the recommendations now, Simon, because I think everyone's finished speaking.
Okay, thanks. Apologise, members. I promise you I'm not playing hide and seek. Zoom's kicking me out for some reason. Okay, so I didn't sense from the conversations I heard there was any objections to the recommendations, but if anybody has got any objections to it, if you just raise your hand function now, otherwise I'll take the recommendations as carried as. Okay, so I can't see anybody, so we'll take that as carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Karen, thank you very much for bringing the paper to us. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Members, I am aware that we have been going for 2 hours now. There is another couple of items on the agenda. Do members wish to proceed or take a short comfort break? Can I get a sense of it?
Short break.
Okay, so we'll take a short comfort break.
I'd wish to proceed. I've got a meeting at 4:30, another one. So,
David, I do appreciate that, but I think in fairness to members, I think they should have a short comfort break till 15:15. If you do have to leave us, I understand that, so it's fine. But we'll see you back here in 16:04 now. So should we